Hello and welcome to The Road to Copenhagen. I'm Susan McGinnis. Executive Editor Margaret Ryan joins me now, and we're talking now about the positions of different countries attending these global talks, sort of a who wants what. Now, one major subject for world leaders is extending the Kyoto Protocol or replacing it. Now, Margaret, we know that the future of the Kyoto Protocol became a big impasse in the talks in Bangkok. Is not Copenhagen all about extending the Kyoto Protocol?
Well, it actually involves both the Rio Treaty and the Kyoto Protocol. The UNFCCC holds these periodic meetings called the Conference of the Parties. They're generally called COPs, and it's normal at the same time that they have a meeting of the parties of the Kyoto Protocols, which nicely trims down to MOPs. You know, the formal acronym is actually CMP, but you hear people talk about the COP and the MOP.
Right.
And the Bali roadmap was set 2 years ago in Bali, Indonesia. It was supposed to be the entire schedule for negotiating up to Copenhagen, and Copenhagen is the 15th COP and the 5th MOP, if you hear those terms. Now, by December, the U.S. will in fact be the only state to have signed the Rio Treaty and not have endorsed the Kyoto Protocol. But the U.S. represents 36% of the Annex 1 country emissions and about 20% of world emissions. It's right behind China there. So, and the Bali roadmap, the UNFCCC set up actually two negotiating tracks. They set up what were called ad hoc working groups. One of them is in fact going after the extension of the Kyoto Protocol, the obligations of the parties from 2013 forward. But the second one, called long-term cooperative action, they're negotiating other approaches and things the U.S. might be more interested in or could participate in. So, and it's not at all clear, I'll tell you, how the two negotiating tracks are eventually going to be brought together.
But it was preserving the Kyoto Protocol that had the U.S., the EU, and China and India at this loggerheads in the Bangkok talks.
Yes, it was. With the Rio Treaty makes carbon control a national responsibility. All the countries have signed on to that. So the LCA is negotiating approaches other than Kyoto that recognize every nation's responsibility, or it doesn't have to replace Kyoto, it could be complementary to it. The U.S. approach would have every country commit to some kind of climate action. The U.S. has proposed a formal protocol here, and it's some kind of action each according to its means, but it has hit this steep resistance from the non-Annex 1 countries. Now, outside of the formal negotiations, the U.S. and China are indeed intensively talking, and they are talking about other mechanisms besides the Kyoto Protocol. But the negotiators in these formal talks are insisting that the only way forward for them is the Kyoto Protocol. That has to be preserved.
So what are the arguments for either extending or ditching the Kyoto Protocol?
Well, essentially the developing nations say the developed countries have to show their commitment to cutting carbon before the developing nations, who came up as emitters much later, should have to do anything at all. That is their argument. The U.S. negotiators are saying, look, that approach simply will not work, and actually the EU negotiators kind of agree with them on this. They say, look, the major emitters now, things have changed since 1997, and the emerging economies like China and India are big, big emitters, and if they're not part of carbon reduction plans, then we just won't get to where we need to be in terms of carbon reduction. A breakthrough on this really is vital, because even people here who support our signing a treaty in Copenhagen say, I know, like John Kerry, Senator John Kerry, he's a big supporter of it, but he says flatly the U.S. will never join Kyoto.
Okay, now, but sticking to the Kyoto Protocol is not the only thing that developing nations want. They want lots of aid and other things.
Oh, yes. With China and India are in the lead, but most other developed countries are right there behind them. They want the industrialized countries, including the U.S., to cut carbon, and they're talking 40% by 2020. 25 to 40% was in the IPCC studies, and this has led to everybody using 40% in the negotiations. They want the industrialized countries to commit to funnel money to the rest of the world to fund adaptation to ongoing climate change, as well as mitigation, and to help the developing countries to grow their economies in a low carbon and sustainable manner. Demands for funds that we've heard in the negotiations leading up to this have run somewhere between $100 and $600 billion a year that should be funneled to these countries. They've generally talked about 0.5% to 2% of the developed nations' GDPs.
Okay, so 2% of GDP. Now, why would an industrialized nation commit to that kind of cash?
Well, on the practical side, if richer nations don't help, a lot of the poorer nations simply can't do anything on their own. They simply won't be able to change. So everyone acknowledges some sort of aid is required, whether it's new technology, sustainable forestry, whatever. And if climate change does make current coastal areas uninhabitable, which there are predictions that could happen, it could cause mass migrations, be socially destabilizing, a lot of problems everywhere. The primary argument, however, in environmental forums that you hear is not the practical one, it's environmental justice. This term, they say the carbon that's causing the problem in the atmosphere comes from countries that aren't being asked to bear the brunt of it. You know, those island nations sinking beneath the Pacific had nothing to do with it. They said the first effects are being felt by poorer countries. It's up to the richer countries to pay for to help them adapt to climate change and to pay for the damages they've created, basically.
Right. Okay. And now we also hear complaints from the less developed countries that promised aid that gets promised to them never gets delivered. How is that being handled in these upcoming talks?
Well, it's one of the naughtiest questions of the negotiations. You put your finger on there. Developing nation governments have lobbied variously to get their aid directly. They don't, by and large, want to have their activities audited internationally, things like this. The current aid goes through multiple UN agencies or international financing institutions, and many times these governments complain, well, dollars go in and pennies come out to us. Proposals have been floated in these international talks for ways of guaranteeing money. Switzerland, for instance, proposed a $2 per ton carbon tax worldwide. There have been several proposals for international taxes on air and sea travel. Mexico has proposed what's called a green fund. They say countries would pledge a certain percentage of their GDP.
And that would just be a contribution.
That would just be a contribution, but because it's done on a percentage of the GDP, then you'd have a certain amount of money coming in, and then it would be up to further negotiations as to how that money goes out. And of course, the various international financing institutions are all jockeying for roles in this because it's very lucrative to be the party that is administering some of these projects, verifying the projects, measuring, and so on. And of course, the donating governments do want to make sure their money is well spent. They don't just want to send it to governments that turn out to be stable or corrupt.
Right. Okay. Well, Margaret, thank you very much for that assessment of who wants what. One of several backgrounders on the road to Copenhagen that Clean Skies News is providing. Click on any of these to find out all you need to know about these global talks coming up in December. I'm Susan McGinnis.